All right, hopefully this records okay, because I'm going to have to stand like out here to see this. I can't see anything on this screen for some reason. So the take-home message here is that when you look at the resistance, it's directly proportional to the length of the blood vessel. So in other words, the longer the blood vessel gets, what happens to resistance? If it's directly proportional. So what that means is if I have one of this, I have to have one of that. If I have two of this, I have to have two of that. If I double the length of the blood vessel, what do I have to do to the resistance? I double the resistance. So what organ of the body is going to have to work harder to try and push that further length? Your heart. So as you gain weight, you get more body fat and you lengthen out these blood vessels, your heart has to pump harder to try and push that. And then the viscosity is exactly the same thing. The thicker the blood, the harder it is to pump the blood, which should make sense. What do you think is going to move through a hose faster, syrup or water? The water. As you make that water thicker with sugar and proteins and other things with syrup, you make it harder and harder to move. It's the same thing with your blood. When you add more red blood cells, when you add more platelets, when you add more white blood cells, all that stuff, proteins to your blood, just makes it thicker, harder to pump. So it's directly proportionate. Resistance goes up when either of those two things get longer or go up. And then it's inversely proportional to the fourth power of the radius, and that's the last thing that I talked about before. So if the radius goes up, what happens to the resistance? So you get a longer radius or a bigger radius, what happens to resistance? Does it get bigger or smaller? Radius gets bigger, resistance gets smaller. The bigger the hose gets, the easier you're going to get flow through it, right? So it's going to move a lot smoother because there's less resistance. But it's not directly proportional. It's actually inversely to the fourth power. So it's just the opposite direction and then to the power 4. So if I double the size, I have to take 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, which is 16 times difference. If I quadruple the size, then it's 4 times 4 times 4 times 4, and what's that, 64 or 128, something like that? It's a huge difference. 4 times 4 is 16, times 4 is a lot. I hate math. And then down here it just shows you, this little squiggly thing tells you that if you take resistance, whatever's on the top of this line is directly proportional, whatever's on the bottom is inversely proportional. And then there's one more law, it's called Poiseuille's law, and it looks like this. So it says overall the blood flow. So you can take that whole flow equals pressure divided by resistance and plug all these things that affect resistance into it. So blood flow, when the pressure goes up, what happens to the blood flow? So if you just change the pressure, what happens to the blood flow? Think about it. Garden hose in the backyard, if you put more pressure into it, what happens to the flow through the hose? It goes faster. So as you increase the pressure, you increase the flow. As you increase the radius, what do you do to flow? Decrease or increase it? Increase it. These numbers on the top, if you increase them, you increase the flow. But on the bottom, this little Greek letter, for the life of me, I'm forgetting the name of it, but it looks like an N. It stands for viscosity, is what it's talking about. So this is the viscosity. As the viscosity gets thicker, what happens to your flow? Does it go up or go down? It goes down. What about length? As the length gets longer, what happens to the blood flow? Does it go up or go down? The longer the hose, is it going to be easier to get blood through it? No, it goes down. So if it's on the bottom, it reduces flow. If it's on the top, it increases flow. So you raise this, you increase flow. You raise this, you decrease flow. I'm never going to make you do complex math, but here's the big picture. I already did this math equation with you like several times. If the vessel's radius decreases by 2, half, what will happen to the flow? Instinctively, what happens to the flow if the vessel radius shrinks? What's your gut tell you right away? Smaller vessel, what happens to flow? It decreases. Does it just decrease by half? What's it going to decrease by? 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. It's going to decrease by a 16. So the vessel radius decreases, the flow goes down with it by 16 times. It's the concept. I keep looking at that screen like it's going to change. I don't know why I do that. All right, so now we're going to go into each of the individual vessels, and they're kind of nicknames for each of them that help me remember what they're there for. In the first one here, you have the rapid transit passageways, the tissues. These are pressure reservoirs. The arteries are the pressure reservoirs. They store pressure. Your heart, when it beats, it goes poof, and pushes 120 millimeters of mercury all at once, and then when it relaxes down to 0. Do your arteries ever go down to 0 pressure? You know, how do you know they don't go back to 0 pressure? Because what do you do to them to measure that? You hook a sphygmomanometer up to them and you take blood pressure. You hear it go up to 120, and then you hear it go down to what? 80, and then it goes back up to 120, and then down to 80, 120, 80, back and forth. The arteries are what you're listening to, not arterioles, not capillaries, not venules, not veins. It's the arteries. They're high-pressure structures. When they pump, they push out, they expand like a balloon, and then as they start slowly going, they never get a chance to completely empty, and the heart pumps again. And they never completely empty. They just push the pressure downstream. They can't push it back into the heart. Why? Why can't they push things back into the heart? Valves. And then some of the properties are the things that make them elastic. You have the elastic property in the artery walls, so you have this connective tissue that's very elastic. It has elastin in it, which helps it to do what? What's your elastic waistband do for you? Besides going to a Chinese buffet and let you stretch out. What else? You pull it out, you let go of it, what's it do? It snaps back. Even when they're old, when the elastic's old, this is really telling you the property. They will still stretch, but what do they lose their ability to do? Recoil, snap back. Elastic properties are the things that help snap back. We'll talk later about what makes it stretch is something called compliance. How compliant it is how stretchable it is. But right now when we're talking about elasticity, we're talking about snap-backedness. I need to start patting these little words, try and get them into the dictionary. So its ability to snap back. And then endothelial cells will actually release a chemical that adjusts how flexible these things are. We'll talk about this in a couple slides, but it'll release things like nitric oxide that allows the blood vessels to open up a little bit wider. It'll release things like endothelin, which causes them to constrict down powerfully. So these endothelial cells have a huge impact. Those are epithelial cells, but when they're lining the blood vessels or they're lining the heart, we call them endothelial cells. And the last one, the smooth muscle. During the muscle lecture, when I talked about the stomach, and I said if the stomach's rapidly expanded, it's smooth muscle, right? What's it want to do instinctively? Chug a gallon of milk. Gluk, 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 gluk. You stretch out that muscle too fast, what's it do? It contracts back. So the smooth muscle itself can respond. We call it a myotonic or myotinic response. It's going to contract back. So when you push a bunch of blood into the artery all at one time, it's just like filling your stomach with milk all at one time. It expands, what's it want to do? Squeeze back and push the blood downstream. As soon as you stretch it out, it wants to contract and squeeze everything downstream. It doesn't like being stretched really quick. So these are three structures that help increase that elasticity or that flexibility in the blood vessels. When we talk about volume and compliance, volume is the amount of blood. Blood pressure directly is affected by volume. If I give you if I straight put into your blood a gallon of water, that's a lot of water. What's going to happen to your blood pressure just right away? It goes up. The more pressure you put in those vessels, or volume you put in the pressure, the more volume you put in the blood vessels, the higher the pressure becomes. So when you start urinating a lot, like if you take a diuretic and you're losing lots and lots of water, what starts happening to your blood pressure? It starts falling. You're losing volume, your blood pressure starts falling. So much so that if you lose enough volume, what do you go into? It starts with the letter S. Shock, right? That's when your blood pressure is so low. You get something called hypovolemic shock. You don't have enough volume to actually get a good blood pressure pushing into the tissues. So volume is going to be a really important concept here. And then the same thing with compliance. It was the opposite of what? Compliance is the ability to stretch out. What's the thing that's the ability to snap back? Elastic. Yeah. So compliance is its stretchability, where elastic is its recoil. You can stretch out elastic waistbands even when they're old. They'll go out, stretch out as far as they did before. Their problem is they don't snap back. They lose that elasticity. Compliance, if you have a little tiny balloon, like the ones they make for water balloons, and you try and blow that thing up, you blow really hard, it's hard to expand it. But you take one of those bouncy ball ones, everybody knows what I'm talking about. I'm not that old, right? Where you have the big balloon, and you have a rubber band connected to it, and you go boom, 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 boom. Okay. That's compliant, because you can like talk, smoke a cigarette, do everything you want it to do, and go and blow this thing up, right? But that little tiny balloon, that thing's hard to blow up. You're going. The big one's more compliant. It's easily what? Stretchable, right? The little one's not so compliant. What you usually find is the little one's more what though? Elastic. Because as soon as you open the valve for that or you open the mouth of that, it goes pushes everything out really quick. This big one goes, right? And it slowly pushes everything out. Oh, you know you like the sound effects. Genevieve loves them, by the way, my baby. So anyway, when you take blood pressure, you're looking for that compliance set. When you're feeling that pulse pressure that we talked about in lab last week, that pushing out, that's the compliance you're feeling. When it's squeezing back and trying to push the blood downstream, that's the elasticity. What's that guy doing wrong? God, this picture always annoys me. I really should just change it. Yeah, it's putting his thumb right on it. Right. And then what do you call this nice smooth flow here? So the smooth flow going through the arteries is called what? Starts with an L. Laminar flow. Yep, it's silent, perfectly silent. All those particles are flowing downstream. But as soon as you pinch off that blood pressure cuff, you start creating what? Turbulence. And that's what you're listening for. If you listen for the sounds up here, you don't hear it. If you listen for sounds down at the radial pulse, you don't hear it either. You have to listen to it right here. Because once it moves beyond this site, what happens to the flow again? It goes back to laminar. So you have to listen for that turbulence. When people have clogged arteries, if you could listen directly to the artery after the clog, you'd hear that every time. And then when you're describing the pressure that's going through the arteries, we described as systolic and diastolic pressure. Systolic is actually referring to what function of the heart? Contraction of what chamber? If you're taking a blood pressure, what are you measuring? The pressure coming out of what chamber? The left ventricle. So systolic pressure is what's happening in the ventricles, not the atria. The systolic pressure should be under 120. So that's the pressure during injection. And here's what happens. The heart squeezes. You can see it pushing the blood in. And just like I said, with that long balloon, it expands the balloon out. And then slowly, during diastole, it starts collapsing back in. But it never goes to zero. So that 120 millimeters of mercury will start slowly pushing the blood downstream. Really, really slow. It can't push back because what's not letting it go back? The valve. And it starts going and before it can actually get to zero, actually before it gets under 80, poof, you have another heartbeat, and you go back to this phase again, systole. And you just do it over and over and over and over. And then the only time that your arteries get to zero is when you die. That's it. So, and you can tell that because there's no more pressure. When people die, anybody know what they call that purpleness of all their hands or extremities? Forced lividity. Nobody's ever heard of that term, huh? So anyway, all the blood pressure just relaxes. It allows all the flow just to go down and into the extremities. All the blood vessels completely relax. It leaves the brain, it leaves the heart, everything just flows to the extremities. All right, so diastole, remember, is the relaxation of the left ventricle. And then pulse pressure, we measured this in lab last week. You have to know how to calculate it. You've seen it in lecture and lab, so you can expect it either on a lab or a lab quiz or an exam. And pulse pressure is easy. You take systolic minus diastolic. So what's normal systole? About 120. What's normal diastole? It's about 80. So what's pulse pressure for the average person? It's 40 millimeters of mercury, and that's what you feel pushing up. You don't feel the 80. At 80, it feels like your pulse is at rest. And then suddenly it goes up to 120. You feel that 40 millimeters of mercury pushing up. And then it comes back down. Then you should also be able to calculate mean arterial pressure. We did this in lab. So remember, you take 1/3 of the pulse pressure. So what's about 1/3? I'm not going to make you do decimal points or anything on that. It's about 13.3, so we're going to say 13. So 13 plus diastole, which is what? Or diastolic pressure, which is 80. Your heart spends more time in diastolic. So when you look at these numbers, you're always going to be closer to diastole. If your math comes out and you come close to systole, you screwed something up. So look at that. It's 1/3, which is 13, plus diastole, or diastolic pressure, which is 80. So you have 93 is the mean arterial pressure, and that's the average pressure pushing blood into the tissues. Your brain doesn't know your radial pulse pressure. It doesn't know what your femoral pulse pressure is. It doesn't know any of those things. It knows the average pressure here, called the M, mean arterial pressure. This is measured in two places that you have to know: carotid arteries and aortic arch. Why is the carotid? Why is your body measuring going here? So that you always have constant flow to the brain. It's one of the, to me, it's the most important organ. So you always want constant flow there. So you're measuring that. And then the other one, the aortic arch, is going where? To everywhere else but the lungs. And those receptors are baroreceptors. What's a barometer measure? Yep, atmospheric pressure. So a baroreceptor measures blood pressure, or pressure in general in your body. The next thing you need to know is where that signal goes. This is measured by the central nervous system, not the heart. So what part of your brain controls life-threatening situations like regulating heart rate, pulse? Colonel Sanders was wrong. It's not there for anger. It's there for your blood pressure, and it's the medulla oblongata. That boy's got something wrong with his medulla oblongata. Nobody ever gets my movie quotes. Waterboy, absolutely. I hated that movie the first time I saw it, but it grew on me. So here's the left ventricle. You can see the pressure goes 120 to 0, 120 to 0, 120 to 0. But when you look at the arteries, they go 120 to 80. And they should have done this a little bit differently. They should have seen a really quick rise and a slow fall. Quick rise, slow fall. But here's your mean arterial pressure. What's it closer to, systolic or diastolic? Diastolic. So it's about 93 here. It comes cruising along. And then as you go into the arterioles, you can see there's less of that jump up and down. It starts smoothing out. And then when you get to the capillaries, you have nice, even flow. So if you look at the capillaries, they're always going they're not pulse, 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 pulse. They're a nice smooth flow, so you're evenly distributing the oxygen and picking up the carbon dioxide as they flow through capillaries. And then when you get to the venules and the veins, the flow goes even slower, the pressure starts dropping, and then you return the blood back to the heart. And then here you can see a quick rise, shoot, systole, and then dichroic notch, and then that slower fall. Quick rise, shoot, dichroic notch, slower fall. So let's see if you can figure this out. If a patient has a blood pressure of 135/90, what's the mean arterial pressure? So take a minute, do your math, and we'll go over it. Oh yeah, that clock is way not right. Okay, so what do you have to do first? Can you take the 135/90 and go straight to mean arterial pressure? Nope, you have to do what with it first? Pulse pressures. Take 135 minus 90 and it comes out to 45, and then what do you do with that number? Divide by 3, so what's 45 divided by 3? 15, what do you do with that number? Add what to it? 135 or 90? 90, so what's your total? 105. Yep, mean arterial pressure in this situation is 105. That's the major points, or those are the major points you have to know about the arteries. They measure what vessels? That's this one. Pressure vessels. So the pressure reservoirs, they store up the pressure. You want to remember, when you're measuring blood pressure, what are you actually measuring? You're measuring at the arteries, but what are you measuring the pressure from? The left ventricle. And then you want to know the terms systole and diastole and how to calculate pulse pressure. Anytime you see a blood vessel on the surface of your skin, by the way, what is it? It's always one of two vessels, a vein or an artery. You never see arterioles, which we're going to talk about. You never see capillaries, you never see venules. They're called microcirculation. They're too small to see. If you see it at the surface of the skin, no matter how small it looks, it's always either an artery or a vein, period. The arterioles, the key with this is these are the transitions into the organ. So your artery carries the blood to the organ right up to the point, and then it branches and starts going into the actual organ. So when it gets to the kidney, you have the renal artery going in, and then it branches out and starts splitting into the little renal arterioles. and it just keeps sub-branching. It's almost like a major river branching into streams and then creeks, and then back from creeks to streams and back to a river and then back to the ocean. It just always branches like that. When you branch off into this little tiny area, you go from the big river into the small streams. That's what the arterioles are. The arterioles are the resistance vessels. They control the resistance. Arteries suck at resistance. They hold the pressure and then they squeeze back. Pressure, squeeze back. They can't adjust resistance. The arterioles adjust resistance. So if an organ doesn't need all that blood, the arterioles will actually do what? Open up or squeeze down? By the way, what's the term for opening up a blood vessel? Vasodilation. What's the term for squeezing down? Vasoconstrict. Oh, yeah, they're right on the bottom of the slide. So you got it. So if an organ has plenty of oxygen, plenty of nutrients, and it doesn't need anymore, all of the organs except the brain are selfless. They say, hey man, I've got plenty of juice going over here, we're all good, I'm going to redirect the blood flow. So what's the arteriole going to do to that organ? Vasodilate or vasoconstrict? It vasoconstricts. It squeezes down and redirects the blood. It basically bypasses that organ. I think I gave this example before. If you're running on a treadmill and you had your arm strapped to your body and you're just running. Did I say that example in here? Oh, it's an awesome one. So anyway, if you're running on a treadmill and you're running really hard, your leg muscles need the blood. What's going to happen to the blood vessels in there? To the quads and the hamstrings and the gastroc and soleus. What's going to happen to those? They're going to dilate. The arterioles open up because of the need of that organ. But what do you think is going to happen to the arms that aren't moving and you're running? With your hands popping back and forth. I so bad want to do it, but I know that would be the day I tripped and fell off the treadmill and flew into the wall. What do you think would happen to the blood vessels in the muscles in your arms that you're not using? They constrict. What color would your arms start turning? White, pale. Where your legs are going to turn really red because you're pumping all that blood to it. The arms, they don't need all of that. They're muscles. They have the same structures. They have the same blood vessels going into them, but they can actually direct by the arterioles how much flow is getting to each organ. So it's kind of cool. The brain controls the general overall flow to places. The heart just does the pump. It's just the machine. But when the brain's starving, it will say, forget all y'all, and redirects everything. I'm going to North Carolina next week, so I'm practicing my dialect. All y'all. That's more than one person, all y'all. If it's one person, it's y'all. And when you order a Coke, it's any kind of soft drink down there. So, anyway, the brain tries to redirect everything, but if your leg needs that, if you're running for your life and you're not putting any blood to your legs, what's going to happen? You're going to run and then fall down, right? And then that thing's going to eat you, whatever was chasing you. So the muscle itself can control the arterioles and redirect the blood flow. The gold or bold points here, what you really want to remember, these are the resistance vessels. They can cause change in radius. Not change in length, not change in viscosity. They directly change the radius within milliseconds. And the system that has the direct control over that is the central nervous system. Would that be intrinsic or an extrinsic control of muscles? Extrinsic. It's something outside the musculoskeletal system that's controlling the musculoskeletal system. What part of your nervous system? Notice there's only one part of it that's highlighted. Sympathetic, not the parasympathetic. Wink, wink, star, star. All the way through the semester, up until the last week, when I talk about the nervous system controlling blood vessel size, it will be the sympathetic nervous system every time. This is hard for some people to think, because if I tell you the sympathetic nervous system causes vasoconstriction, it releases adrenaline, it causes your blood vessels to squeeze down. And I ask you, so what would cause them to open back up again? What do you naturally want to say? If the sympathetic causes constriction, you naturally want to say, parasympathetic causes vasodilation. That's wrong. If your sympathetic turns on and it causes vasoconstriction, turning off the sympathetic causes vasodilation. The only analogy that always pops in my head is if you were driving down the road and you're going 75 miles an hour, you come over a hill and you're doing 5 over the speed limit, and you see a cop, what do you do? Hell no, you don't hit the brakes. How do you slow down? Because they know that. They watch for that, right? They already got you clocked. And then when they see that you know you made a mistake, oh, you're busted. Because the front of your car will actually dip when you hit the brake, so what do? Let off the accelerator. It's the same thing with the blood vessels. You don't have a brake to stop the blood vessels. There's no parasympathetic control over the blood vessels. All you have is an accelerator, and when you let off of it, you decelerate. So when the sympathetic turns on, it causes vasoconstriction. When you let off the sympathetic, it causes vasodilation. It's a super important point. I promise I will ask a question about that on a test. You have to know it. And if I'm telling you now, do you think you're going to need to know it beyond this class? Absolutely. When you stab somebody with an epinephrine pin, an EpiPen, what's it mimicking? Parasympathetic or sympathetic? Sympathetic. There's a reason you don't stab them with an acetylcholine pin, because it just doesn't work. You stab them with an EpiPen because what it's going to do is cause that sympathetic nervous response. They get agitated, they get irritated, they're like anxious feeling, and all their blood vessels are doing what to push blood to their head? Squeezing. The reason you give it to them is because they're going into what? Shock. Their blood vessels are all doing what? Vasodilating, so you give them a sympathetic mimicker that causes vasoconstriction. I feel like I've spent a long time on this slide, but it's super important to remember that. By the way, what's the hormone? Sympathetic nervous system, what's the hormone that's going to cause vasoconstriction? I'll give you a hint. It's also a neurotransmitter. I'll give you another hint. It comes from the adrenal gland. I'll give you another hint. It's adrenal right, adrenaline. Epinephrine. Norepinephrine, epinephrine. Okay, so vascular tone, we've talked about this before. It's a smooth muscle, not cardiac muscle and not skeletal muscle controlling this. So when you have vascular tone, you always have some tone to it, just like we said with smooth muscle before. If you have no tone, all the blood would go where in your body? All the blood vessels would just be dilated, and what would happen to all of your blood? It'd race to your feet. So you always have this slight tone. We call that myogenic activity, muscle-generated activity. The muscles always hold a little bit of tone. When you're sitting down right now, or you're laying down, your muscles have less tone in them. The smooth muscle has less tone in it. So they're open a little bit more. But if you're sitting down or you're lying down, you have more of this even distribution. As soon as you stand up, you have a straight path from your head to your feet. Where's the blood want to go? Down. So what has to happen? What do you have to do to keep you from passing out and falling over? You have to squeeze all the blood vessels, all the arterioles in your body have to squeeze slightly to try and push that blood back upwards. Right? So that's the sympathetic nervous system doing it. People that have head or brain damage or damage to their head, when they stand up too quick, how do they feel? Lightheaded. Anybody know what that's called? Orthostatic hypotension. They get lightheaded because their sympathetic nervous system didn't respond fast enough, or there's some kind of a block in signal that they can't get that signal out fast enough. So two major controllers of vascular tone, sympathetic and myogenic. As soon as your blood pressure starts dropping a little bit, your medulla oblongata goes, holy crap, and starts squeezing just a little, releases a little bit of adrenaline into your system, just a little to get a small vasoconstriction to push that pressure back up. And then here is just an analogy from your text. Here you can see if you completely close that blood vessel off. If you get bit by most poisonous snakes, they're powerful vasoconstrictors in their venom. This is what they do to the venom. If it gets in your blood, it goes to your other blood vessels, goes all over the place, and starts squeezing all of your blood vessels, except the ones to the brain. So where's all the blood start rushing to? Up to your brain. And they don't get lightheaded and pass out because they have no blood in their brain. If you look at their eyes, guess what's happening? All that blood's going to their brain, and all the little blood vessels in their brain and their eyes and everything are starting to do what? They're hemorrhaging. They're busting apart. They're going, so if you look at their eyes, they start having all those veins or arteries showing up in their eyes, and then they'll start hemorrhaging. They actually bleed to death in their brain from the wound. Right, that would be this example. The muscles wouldn't get any blood. The liver, the kidney, none of the organs would be getting any blood. Here you can see open blood flow. This is what would happen with histamine. Histamine opens up your blood vessels maximally and just distributes to everything evenly. Your body can't handle that. You need to evenly distribute appropriately, but when you just open up all the vessels, most of it's going to go to the feet and the legs. So normally you have a little bit of tone allowing just a little bit of flow, so in the middle. And then your brain's actually measuring this as MAP, your mean arterial pressure. Your heart just does one pump. And then each organ gets different distribution based on whether there's sympathetic control or there's that muscle control. Right, and then I mentioned this a couple times already this semester, but the blood supply of the brain is always consistent. So all the time, when you're sleeping, when you're waking, when you're exercising, the blood flow to the brain is always staying consistent. It'll regulate other organs to try and keep it that way. So if you're not getting enough blood flow to the brain, it starts squeezing blood flow to the other organs. If you're getting too much blood flow to the brain, it'll start opening up blood flow to the other organs. Once the blood gets in there, if you know anything about MRIs, we're measuring flow to different areas of the brain, but you're always getting constant flow to the brain in general. It's just being redirected once it's inside of there. So if I'm using this part of my brain, I redirect flow to that side, and I cut it down over here. Kind of an interesting or tricky concept. Right, you have to know these. Star. This is talking about vasoconstriction. The next slide is talking about vasodilation. You'll see a lot of them are directly opposing each other. So right away, without even looking, if a muscle has plenty of oxygen, what do you want to do to the blood vessel? Do you want to open it up and get more oxygen, or do you want to close it down and redirect that oxygen? If this muscle has plenty of oxygen, does it need blood? So what do you instinctively do to the blood vessel? Vasoconstrict. If there's barely any carbon dioxide in there, what do you do to the blood vessel? Do you need to flush out that carbon dioxide if there's barely any in there? Nope. So what do you do to the blood vessel? Open it up and flush, or just close it down and redirect? Close it down and redirect. If you ever put an ice pack on a muscle and you pull it off, what color is the tissue underneath? It's white and pale. Why? What happened to the blood vessels under there? They constricted. So some of these things are like common sense if you just step back from it a second and say, what would cause vasoconstriction? Well, I have plenty of blood in the muscle already, I don't need more. I have plenty of oxygen, I don't need more. It's cold, so the muscle constricts to prevent the blood from getting too cold. So those things are kind of instinctive. The myogenic activity just means increased muscle activity, so you increase that, the smooth muscle starts constricting down. These last ones, these are hormones, and anytime you see a hormone, you want to underline it. The last 3 weeks of class, I'm going to beat you to death with hormone names, so it's good just to start remembering them now. This first one's called endothelin. It's released from an endothelial cell. What's an endothelial cell do? It lines blood vessels. So it's, like I said before, it's that endothelial cell that's on the inside that affects how the blood vessel's moving. Endothelin is one of the most powerful vasoconstrictors we know, period. The only other vasoconstrictor that pops in my mind that's as powerful as endothelin is snake venom. Super powerful. Your blood vessels actually make this stuff. If you release too much of it, it would just start squeezing off that organ and you actually wouldn't get any blood flow. It's good because if you lose a limb or something, if it's amputated in the field, or something happens, then that endothelin starts releasing and it starts constricting that blood vessel to try and keep you from bleeding to death, which would be a good thing. Sympathetic stimulation. So as soon as you turn on the sympathetic nervous system, you automatically want to think, in general, almost all the time it's going to cause vasoconstriction. Except to what organ? The brain. It's going to constrict the muscles. It's going to constrict to the kidney. So when you start going into shock, the brain's going to keep the blood flowing up to the brain. It's going to start squeezing off blood to all the other organs. You'll see those people start turning pale because their skin's not getting circulation. They're having a hard time moving their muscles. They're getting weak because they're not getting circulation in the muscles. Their kidneys will start shutting down. Is that good or bad? That's way bad. So the kidneys aren't getting oxygen. They're not getting nutrients. They're not cleaning. So there's toxins starting to build up in the body. Sympathetic is out for one thing, the brain. It's looking to protect the brain. So it's going to squeeze off all the blood vessels or constrict all the blood vessels to all the other organs but the brain. And then vasopressin and angiotensin. Look at the names. Vaso tells you what? Vessel, and then pressin reminds you of what? Reminds me of pressure, vessel pressure. So this thing is squeezing on the blood vessels, which is causing what? Vasodilation or vasoconstriction? Vasoconstriction, the name itself gives it away. Later we'll talk about another name. It's called vasopressin, or ADH is exactly the same hormone. Antidiuretic hormone. And then angiotensin. Angio is referring to vessels too. Angiotensin does what to your blood vessels? Creates tension, constriction. Both of those hormones kind of give away what they do. So vasopressin and angiotensin 2, the sequel. There's actually an angiotensin 1 and an angiotensinogen, so these names become significant later. Right, so 3 new hormones you've seen here. The sympathetic stimulation. By the way, what hormone will the sympathetic stimulation increase? We already know it releases the neurotransmitter adrenaline. What hormone will it release too? It releases the neurotransmitter adrenaline. What hormone does it release also? Adrenaline. Same one. It's a neurotransmitter and a hormone. When it comes from a neuron, it's a neurotransmitter. When it comes from the what gland, it's a hormone. The adrenal gland, it's a hormone. Same chemical, it's just released from 2 different places by 2 different systems. Exactly the same chemical. And then cold, I already talked about that. So if you remember these, the opposite of all of these things except the hormones will do just the opposite. So vasodilation, hot instead of cold, low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, and then decreased myogenic activity, all opposites. Just the names of the hormones are what change. Oh, I forgot. Decreased sympathetic instead of increased sympathetic. I'm a lazy thinker. If there's a list that is directly the opposite of another one, I just remember it's exactly the opposite except with these things. Here are these things. Nitric oxide is the opposite of endothelin. You don't instinctively know that. You just have to know the 2 different names of the hormones. Technically, nitric oxide is a gas. It causes vasodilation. Back in the 80s, they went, wow, vasodilation. If we give people a chemical that releases nitric oxide, it will help with their cardiac issues. If they're not getting enough blood flow through the coronary circulation, we give them nitric oxide. It will open up the blood flow and increase their blood flow to their heart. Brilliant idea, but the problem is these people have put so many layers of plaque in the blood vessel, they're not opening anymore. They're as open as they're going to get, so you can give them all kinds of nitric oxide and it's not helping the coronary circulation. But the guys that were taking this were actually guys, like 80-year-old men. They were coming back for refills and refills. They're like, who gives a damn about my heart? This piece of junk is working now. So we actually quit selling it as a heart vasodilator, and now we sell it as a penile vasodilator, and it's the little blue pill Viagra. Yeah. So nitric oxide causes vasodilation all through the body, wherever you have blood vessels. And then histamine, you already knew this because when you go in, what do we associate with histamine? What kind of reaction? Allergies, right. So allergic reactions. When you get an allergic reaction, what happens to the tissue where that allergen was at? It starts swelling up because you have increased blood flow. What's happening when you increase blood flow? Constriction or dilation? Dilation. Increased blood flow, it feels warm because you have all that hot blood in there. You get edema in the area because of all that fluid that's moving into the tissues. It's because of this chemical histamine. If that histamine gets in your bloodstream, it will do that to all of the blood vessels in your body. What do we call that? If all the blood vessels start opening up, what's going to happen to your blood pressure? Plummets. What do we call that when it's life-threatening blood pressure plummeting? Shock. It causes what kind of shock? Anaphylactic shock. Yep. Right, so here's just an example, and then what would that be? Dilation or constriction? Here's normal constriction. You can actually see the blood vessel, all that smooth muscle squeezing down. What happened to your radius? Decreased. So what happened to your flow? Decreased. What happened to your resistance? Increased. So if you shrink the radius, you increase the resistance, which causes a decrease in flow. You have to keep all those concepts in mind. And then here you have vasodilation, where you can see it opens up. The smooth muscle relaxes, the blood vessel opens up, and there you see the list of the things that we talked about before. Right. And then local control. This is an intrinsic control. Extrinsic was the sympathetic and the endocrine system. Local control is an intrinsic control. It's the muscle itself controlling the flow through the arterioles. So you have to think of when you're exercising hard. When you're exercising hard, what happens to your oxygen in that muscle? It goes up or down. Exercising hard, you're making ATP, which means you're burning oxygen. Your oxygen goes down. What happens to your CO2? Goes up. Both of those things caused vasodilation. So what's going to happen to the blood flow in that area? It goes up. That's active hyperemia. So active hyperemia is increasing blood flow to that muscle. Hyper means what? More or less? More than. And emia is referring to the what? Blood. Active hyperemia is talking about an increased blood flow to that area because of some kind of activity or activation. And then local chemical influences like metabolism, you build up CO2 because you're metabolizing nutrients. Histamine, same idea. Both of those things do what? Cause vasodilation. Yep. If you decrease the metabolism, if you decrease energy burning, what do you think is going to happen to those blood vessels? You're going to vasoconstrict. And then local physical changes like the temperature change. When you're exercising hard, what happens to that muscle? All that friction is creating heat. And the hotter the muscle gets, what do you know is going to happen to the circulation? Constrict or dilate? It dilates, so it's going to turn all red, and you're going to see an increased blood flow. All right. And then extrinsic control, I've already mentioned a couple times. So sympathetic and the endocrine system. Where's the cardiovascular control center? What's the name of that part of the brain that controls your heart rate? I'm going to beat it into your head. I swear to God, I'm going to beat it into your head. It's the medulla oblongata. Life-threatening medulla. Coughing, sneezing, choking, gagging, vomiting, hiccuping, sneezing. Never remember the other three dwarfs' names, but all those dwarfs. And then, of course, heart rate and, yeah, Doc, ironically, is one of them. But heart rate and breathing. Breathing. So you have to remember the medulla oblongata. Where are the receptors that send a signal to the medulla oblongata to tell it what to do with your blood vessels? Two places. Carotid, yep, so carotid sinus, and then the aortic arch. And then hormonal influences, vasopressin, angiotensin, epinephrine. You could actually throw in nitric oxide too, which is technically a gas, not a hormone. But right. So if you put a flow chart together, you can see all these influences. If you've noticed, each time I show these pictures, it gets a little bit bigger. It's because we've already talked about this stuff up here. The viscosity of the blood, the number of blood cells, the plasma proteins in it. We've talked about the radius of the arteries. We've talked now about the control of the different size. We've talked about what was the other third thing that affects resistance? Length. Yep. So here you can see local controls, burning energy, the smooth muscle itself, oxygen, CO2 levels, and then extrinsic controls where you see the hormones, and then sympathetic control. Those all control resistance. And when you collectively put all of them together, we call it the total peripheral resistance. It's all the resistance out there in the outside part of the body. So here are some values you have to be able to calculate too. Look at the equation up there. Flow equals change in pressure divided by resistance. It's the same equation, we're just changing some of the names. Flow now is cardiac output. It's how much flow is coming out of the heartbeat in 1 minute. What's one heartbeat? How much volume comes out in one heartbeat? Something volume. S volume. It's called SV for short. Stroke volume. Cardiac output's how much is coming out in 1 minute. Stroke volume's one heartbeat. How do you calculate cardiac output with stroke volume? Stroke volume times... Ugh, you got to go back. You may as well start putting equations on a card. Cardiac output is the number, or the amount of volume per minute. If you know a volume, what else do you have to calculate in there? How many heart rate? Exactly. How many times will you pump this volume in 1 minute to get the cardiac output? SV, stroke volume times heart rate equals cardiac output. That's one way to calculate cardiac output. Another way is you can actually put cardiac output in the place of flow. Look at the overall body resistance and the overall body pressure. Okay. So we can take the mean arterial pressure and put it up in the top slot, MAP. And then you can take the total peripheral resistance, all the things creating resistance in the blood, and put it underneath. And then you have your overall effect on cardiac output. So it's the same equation, you just change the names a little bit. Cardiac output's flow, mean arterial pressure, and then total peripheral resistance. Pressure goes in the pressure slot, resistance goes in the resistance slot, and you can do the math. And then again, arterioles are the only ones that are regulated intensely because they determine the flow or the cardiac output. It's the arterioles that determine the flow going into the organs, not the arteries. The arteries are dumb. They just take the pressure from the heart and then they redirect it. Pressure, redirect. It's the arterioles that determine if the flow is going into an organ or not going into an organ. So if I gave you a question like this, can you do the math? okay, how can I figure this out? If a patient has a blood pressure of 135 over 90 and his TPR is 3, what's the cardiac output? How would you figure this out? You're trying to get cardiac output, and you can either do cardiac output as heart rate times stroke volume, but obviously you don't get either of those in here. So what's the other way to calculate cardiac output? Yep, cardiac output is a flow, so you just take the MAP divided by the TPR. So what's the only thing you have to calculate here? Well, first. Yep, 135 divided by 90, or minus 90 is 45. We already did this. Divided by 3 is 15. So that was what? What's the MAP? 105 divided by 3, which is about 35. Yeah, so it's about 35. On a test, you won't need a calculator. It's all things you can do on paper, and I'm not going to go super specific, and I usually won't do, 30 and 35 is pretty close, actually. But it was definitely 35. Next blood vessels, the capillaries. Capillaries are the exchange vessels. Underline, write it down, whatever you have to do. It's the site of exchange. When you go to arteries, man, they're thick. They've got all this muscle, all this connective tissue. It's hard to do what with oxygen and CO2? What process of taking it from high to low concentration? It's hard to diffuse. It's hard to diffuse nutrients into the wall. In fact, if you remember does anybody remember vasovasorum, what that means? How many people remember that word from anatomy? OMG. So the vasovasorum literally means the vessels to the vessels. Your arteries, they can't pull. It's just like the atria and the ventricles. You can't get blood from the atria and the ventricles into the heart muscle. You actually have to have blood vessels that go into the heart muscle. It's the same thing with the blood vessels, ironically, or coincidentally, whatever you want to call it, is that the blood vessels, they're too thick. The arteries, the arterioles, the venules, the veins, they're too thick on the wall. They have to have their own blood vessels to supply blood to the vessels. It's crazy. It's called vasovasorum. But the blood vessels come back around. The only thing that can supply nutrients to the tissues are capillaries. That's it. Because capillaries are how many cells thick? 1. Perfect for diffusion. In fact, they're not only one cell thick, they weave over each other, so they have these little gaps, these pores, so things can leak back and forth. Capillaries are the site of exchange. You get water leaking through the pores, you get the lipids to go wherever they want, you get oxygen going wherever it wants, CO2 going where it wants, sugar seeps through the pores, you get lots of exchange here. It's almost like a sprinkler system on your garden hose in the backyard. You've got all this hosing that's like arteries and arterioles, there's no leaking there until you get to the capillary sprinkler. And then it's just distributing everything all over the place. All right, so what makes them so ideal? I already mentioned this, the thin capillary wall, and then they have a large surface area. And this seems counterintuitive. You think, wow, look at this big artery blood vessel. But when you look at the aorta is like, roughly an inch across. It's about, 2 centimeters across. It seems big because you can see with your naked eye, but there's only one of it. You have literally millions of capillaries. Even though they're invisible to the naked eye, because there are millions of them, if you spread them out, their surface area is huge. So it's actually like thousands of square feet of capillary, where you have maybe square meter worth of blood vessel when you're looking at all the major arteries combined. It's not that big. So the capillaries have a large surface area overall when they're all combined. Another benefit is that the blood moves slowly, so what's it get a chance to do if the blood's going shh? Where in the artery it goes goosh, goosh, goosh really quick. It doesn't have a chance to do what? Diffuse. It doesn't have a chance to let oxygen diffuse, but when it's going really smooth and slow, you can actually watch the flow. It's about 1 millimeter a second. So if you tracked one red blood cell through a capillary, you can watch it move. It'll go fast in the beginning, and then it slows down really slow, and then starts speeding up as it goes back to the venules. So if you look overall, here you can see there's your aorta, but then it branches into smaller arteries and then arterioles going into the organ, and then you have all those capillaries. So if you took that surface area here, compared to the surface area here, you have way more surface area. I know it's up here somewhere. There we go, cross-sectional area. And then when you look at the velocity, the speed, look at the aorta, super fast. So it's 500 millimeters per second. When you get down here to the capillaries, it's about 1 millimeter per second. So at the slowest part, you've got like a half At the little bit faster part, you got, about 2. So it's averaging out right around 1 millimeter a second. Slow flow, perfect for exchange. But when you look at the blood volume, you have the same volume consistently because what goes in must come out. So if you push a certain volume into the capillary beds, you have to pull the same volume out. Otherwise, you start building up blood and you get what? E word that's accumulating in that tissue. Edema. So again, it's like a river branching into streams, branching into little creeks. Creeks go back into streams, go back into the giant river. If you look at Lake Des Moines, or is that what that is? No, Saylorville Lake? I guess that's Saylorville Lake, isn't it? Is it Lake Des Moines? Yeah, I don't know. I've only been here for like 15 years. What do I know? So anyway, when you look, you've got rivers that go into it, but out on the actual lake, it's really still out here. There's water flowing through, but it feels really still. But when you get back to the river, it's really fast going again. So the velocity changes, but the flow stays the same all the way along. There's a picture of the capillary. You can see the pores where things leak back and forth. What is so special about the capillaries in the brain? What do you know about these pores in the brain? What cell is plugging them up and holding them? Astrocytes. Yeah, they squeeze on them, they hold it so that blood can't seep back and forth. When you look at the inside of the blood vessel, this is looking straight down the tube. You can see the pores from the side, so watery substances, glucose, electrolytes like sodium, potassium, calcium, all those can leak back and forth between the blood and the interstitial fluid, the 2 extracellular fluids, the major extracellular fluids. When you want large proteins, they can't get out. Large proteins that are in your blood, like albumin, immunoglobulins, they stay in the blood. They don't seep out very easily. If you want them to get across, you have to have a special transporter and move them by what cytosis on this side? Endo, and then what on that side? Exo. Yeah, it's a process getting them across. And then the brain, of course, you plug these up. So anything that has a plus or a minus over it is electrically charged. It loves what? Fat or water? Loves water. It's polar. It loves that charge on water. So it has to move through these pores or get transported. If it's CO2, which is neutral and tiny, or oxygen, which is also neutral and also very, very tiny, it can seep right through the wall and get into the tissues. It diffuses easily from high to low concentration. So you have high concentration of oxygen usually in the blood, low in the muscle because the muscle is burning the oxygen, and it just seeps across. You build up the CO2 in the muscle, and then it seeps back across into the blood. And we'll talk about this extensively. But it's just kind of the big picture that what you get at capillaries you don't get anywhere else. What's this whole slide telling you? Diffusion and exchange. Yeah, you're getting exchange here. The next major concept is this is a capillary bed. So you can imagine this being a muscle. Here are the blood vessels coming into the muscles, which are the arterioles. Blood vessels going out, the venules. When you look, the arterioles are surrounded by smooth muscle, but look at what's missing on capillaries. They have no smooth muscle. You can't have smooth muscle around a capillary because what do you want to happen at a capillary? Easy diffusion. If you put thick muscle around it, what's going to happen to diffusion? It stops. So you have no smooth muscle around the capillaries. You do, however, have smooth muscle right here at the transition from arteriole to capillary, and it's called a met arteriole. It's the transition arteriole. A met arteriole has a special smooth muscle called a precapillary sphincter, and you have to write this down. Precapillary sphincters are not controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. No controls of precapillary sphincters by the sympathetic at all. So you can dump adrenaline after adrenaline after adrenaline, and these things don't respond to it. Guess why? They don't have a what to adrenaline. They don't have a receptor. There's no receptor for adrenaline on these precapillary sphincters, so they don't respond to it. You can pour adrenaline all over it, but because there's no alpha or beta receptors, they do nothing. No adrenergic receptors. So the only thing precapillary sphincters are controlled by are metabolic functions. Oxygen, CO2, heat, endothelin, nitric oxide, all those things that result from metabolism or local intrinsic controls control these. And this is why it's so important. If I'm running for my life, my sympathetic nervous system is going to do what to these blood vessels going into the muscle? Sympathetic turns on, dumps adrenaline onto these muscles and causes these ones on the arterioles to do what? Constrict. What just happened to flow into that leg muscle? It decreased, but I need it to run for my life. So what are these precapillary sphincters going to do? They're going to start opening. They're going to try and pull as much blood as they possibly can out of those arterioles. They're going to open up wide open, and they're going to redirect the flow into the capillaries. If this is the arm strapped to my side, does it need flow? Nope. So the sympathetic squeeze down the arterioles, and the precapillary sphincters are also going to squeeze down. And if you look, that's going to redirect the flow, so it bypasses the muscle. This precapillary sphincter shuts, this one shuts, so no flow goes into this capillary bed. But it goes straight through to the venule and goes to the next muscle. Does that make sense? So the capillary beds are actually controlled by local control only, not by the sympathetic nervous system. All the other blood vessels are controlled by the sympathetic, but not the capillaries. I keep looking at that clock and I'm like, holy crap, it's 8 o'clock. Is the minute hand even accurate? Not really. Okay, so here's a moral of the story slide. The nervous system supply or smooth, neither nervous system supply or smooth muscle are controlled here, or controlling this. It's only by local intrinsic controls. I really wish I could see this so I could read it, but so number one, I told you probably 10 times, the organ's resistance is directly controlled by arterioles and sympathetic activity. But once it gets into the organ, it's the capillaries that are doing the control. It's the precapillary sphincters. Arterioles are controlling blood flow in. I've said that so many times. But it's the capillaries inside that determine where it's going within the muscle. Oh, flow chart. Step over. So here's just an example. If you see a drop in oxygen or an increase in CO2, what's obviously happening in this muscle? Is it relaxing or exercising? If you're burning oxygen and making CO2, you are exercising. What would you expect to happen to the temperature of this muscle? It's hot. So you've got loss of oxygen, increased CO2, hot temperature. All those cause vasodilation. Yep, so all those are local vasodilators. So you're going to see relaxation of the capillary sphincters. They're vasodilating, opening up. You're going to see the arterioles vasodilating because of local control. You see increased blood pressure here. You see capillaries increasing their blood flow. You're getting all this fresh oxygen coming into the muscle. You're getting all the CO2 carried away, and you're nurturing it. If you're lacking in oxygen, that muscle is going to be starving. It's going to say, screw you, brain, I'm doing my own local control. That's the benefit. Sympathetic can control all of the organs, but the organs actually have the final say. If they need it to survive, they're going to try and overpower the brain locally. If your muscle is putting out lots of CO2, lactic acid, burning all the oxygen, it doesn't matter what the brain says, that muscle is going to open up flow and try and get flow there. So final effect, you get the exchange of the tissue. And I keep saying muscle over and over again, but it's any organ. Whether it's the liver or the spleen or the small intestine, large intestine, any of those, if they need the flow, they'll actually allow the flow locally. Right, and then the big concept here, bulk flow and passive diffusion. Bulk flow is when you're distributing large items across. That's the endocytosis, exocytosis, moving back and forth. And then passive diffusion is just things moving down their concentration gradient. So solutes like electrolytes, sodium, potassium chloride, sugar, all of those. And that's the exchange that's happening at the capillaries. So here you can see if I bring some glucose along, high glucose here, the glucose diffuses out into the interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid, since it's high glucose, is going to allow it to be shifted into the cells. The cells are going to take it in, but the cells are constantly burning glucose to make what? ATP, so their supply is always low. It's constitutively low. It's always low all the time. So what are they always trying to do? Pull glucose and what else in with them? With glucose? Oxygen. It's constantly pulling glucose and oxygen in. It's always low supply. But it's always high supply of what? What do you turn it into? Not just ATP. ATP is being burned right away. What's the other byproduct you're accumulating? Only if it's glycolysis. Carbon dioxide. So you're accumulating CO2. That CO2 builds up. It's always high CO2 here, so it goes into the interstitial fluid, and then the interstitial fluid is now getting high, and it goes into the blood, and the CO2 is carried up, back to the heart, over to the lungs, and dumped out. So watch where things are moving by passive diffusion. They always want to go down their concentration gradient, and the cell is always on the low end of the concentration for good things and always on the high end for bad things. Waste products are always slightly higher in the cell than in the blood, so where's the waste product naturally want to go? to the blood. Why would it go to the blood? Because the blood's going to do what with it? Take it to the kidneys or whatever and urinate it out. Get rid of it. Take it to the liver and process it, whatever it has to do. Take it to the lungs and blow it out for CO2. And then your book shows the concentration gradient. High here, low here. This little thing means it has a transporter. Glucose is a big particle. Does it easily diffuse through the cell? No, it has to have a what to move it back and forth? A transporter, yeah. We'll talk about that a lot, especially in the GI tract. We'll talk about those glucose transporters. So glucose moves in, oxygen just diffuses through because it's small and uncharged. And then you're always making CO2, water, and ATP. You put the CO2 out here, the water out here, put the CO2 and the water into the blood. The CO2 gets exhaled, the water gets, some of it gets exhaled, water vapor, but you also primarily do what with the water you accumulate in the body? Tinkle, tinkle, little star, right? Okay, this is a major, major concept. You'll have to understand it. I defy the book just a little bit, just for simplicity. So look at my notes, not the book for this section. Ultrafiltration. If you look all the way through medicine, all the rest of your life that you're in medicine, we in medicine use one liquid in the body as your reference point to determine what's going on with everything in the body. What's that liquid? Blood. Use blood as your reference point. If you are sick and you go to the doctor, what's the first thing you want to do? Take a blood sample. If you're feeling down or whatever, they go in, they take a blood sample. They look at everything. They look at hormones, they look at the proteins, they look at all those stuff in your blood. We use this as a reference point. So when we talk about filtration, we're talking about filtering the blood. When you filter something, what are you trying to do? You're trying to take stuff out. So are you adding or subtracting? You're subtracting. Anytime you see the word filtration in the body, you're taking away something. So if they give you a value, a number, put a minus in front of it. So if they say that your filtration pressure is 20, what do you put in front of that 20? A minus sign. You're taking 20 pressure, trying to pull things out of the blood. Right? So it's something going into the tissue and out of the blood is the key. Out of the blood, into tissues. It doesn't matter if it's lung tissue, taking CO2 out of the blood and into the tissue, the lung tissue to blow it out, or if you're talking about oxygen from the blood going into the muscle. Second is reabsorption, or even you'll see it as absorption. You're absorbing where? Into the blood. If you eat a sandwich, where do you want to get those nutrients? How do they get around your body? Because you absorb them into the blood. Yep. If I give you a medication, they want you to absorb it into the blood. If you breathe in oxygen, you absorb it into the blood. See the point? What are you doing? Are you taking away from the blood or adding to? You're adding it to. So anytime you see a reabsorption force or an absorption force, it's always adding. When we reabsorb in the kidney, so your kidney is trying to lose some sugar, or not trying, it's accidentally losing some sugar. You're going to reabsorb that sugar where? To the blood. You're going to keep reabsorbing it. So this term will come back over and over again. When we get to the lungs, when we talk about kidney, when we talk about the GI tract, filtration and reabsorption forces keep popping up. Filtration is out of the blood, reabsorption is into the blood. You have to know these four forces. There are 2 filtration forces and 2 reabsorption forces. So the first one, capillary blood pressure. This is your heart beating, cranking up the blood flow to the sprinkler. What's it doing? Is it pulling stuff into the blood or trying to push stuff out of the blood? You turn up the sprinkler, what's happening? Are you pulling more water into the hose or pushing water out of the end of the hose? Out. This is a force that's trying to push stuff out. What sign should you have here? Plus or minus? Minus. Capillary blood pressure is a filtration force. Anytime you see that filtration or you see the minus, you know it's trying to filter something out of the blood. You're trying to filter oxygen into the tissues. You're trying to filter CO2 out of the lungs. So either way, you're pulling that stuff out of the blood. Next one, blood colloid osmotic pressure. This is because of the solutes in the blood. Proteins, electrolytes, blood cells. Colloid's talking about basically proteins in the blood. Whether proteins build a cell, proteins like albumin, proteins like antibodies, blah, blah, blah. What do proteins do to water? Do they repel it or do they attract it? We did this the first week of lab. If I put a solute in a solution, what's it want to do to water? Does it want to repel the water or pull the water? Pulls it. The more protein you have in your blood, what's it going to do? Is it going to push water out of the blood or is it going to pull more water into the blood? into. It's adding, it's reabsorbing more water. The more protein you have in your blood, the more you retain water. If it's that time of the month, estrogens cause you to build more proteins in your blood. To do what? Pull more water. It makes you thirsty, because why would you want to pull more water into your blood? Because what are you doing? You're actually losing more blood volume, so you're trying to bring the volume back up. Right around that time, you start getting the bloating effects because you're trying to pull all this water into your body. It's these proteins. Are they trying to reabsorb or filter? Are they trying to filter water out and make you get rid of that water? No, they're trying to pull it in, plus or minus. It's a plus sign. Blood calorie osmotic pressure. And we'll talk about that in excruciating detail the last week of class. I'm so glad I'm not a woman. Female body is so complex. We have testosterone, we go ugh, we kill things and eat it. That's man. Women is very complex. All right, interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure. So this is saying, this is hydrostatic, this is the water pressure accumulating in between the cells, not in the blood. So if I start accumulating lots of water underneath my skin, what's it want to do? Does it want to pull things out of the blood or push it back into the blood? Push it back in. It's like taking your hand and squeezing. That's hydrostatic pressure. When you let go, what happens to all of the tissue underneath your hand where you're squeezing? All of that fluid went where? Did it seep out of your skin? Nope, you just squeezed it all into the blood and pushed it further downstream. Is that filtering or reabsorbing? It's reabsorbing. That hydrostatic pressure is the fluid, the pressure from your atmosphere, from your skin, from your muscles trying to push the fluid back into the blood. It's reabsorbing. Plus or minus? Plus. It's reabsorbing or adding to the blood. Bless you. And then the last one, interstitial fluid colloid. So this is the interstitial fluid proteins. Proteins free floating outside of the blood. What are they going to do water? Push the water into the blood or pull it out of the blood? Out. The solutes are not in the blood this time. They're in the interstitial fluid. They're trying to pull water out. If you get a bunch of proteins underneath your skin and starts pulling water out, what's going to happen to your skin? It starts swelling. What do we call that? Edema. When you have histamine in your system, histamine opens those capillary pores like this. Now proteins can start leaking out. The proteins leak out of the blood. What does the water want to do? Does it want to stay in the blood where the proteins are disappearing? Nope, it wants to chase the proteins out, and you get edema, swelling, that localized swelling. So you should have 2 pluses and 2 minuses on this list. What are the 2 pluses? What are the 2 things that cause reabsorption? Blood colloid osmotic, that's the proteins in the blood pulling it back in, and the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure trying to push the water back into the blood. Those are called reabsorptions, and then the filtration are the other 2, and you have to know these. Again, I describe it differently than the book because I try and make it simple instead of spending 5 pages explaining this. I'm just trying to make it life simple, and I'm making it more applicable for down the road. So now your big picture is that when you see these different letters or initials, you want to put a plus or minus in front of it, and then just total them. Take a sum. Capillary blood pressure, was that pushing into or out of the blood? Out. What do you put in it? Plus or minus? Minus. And then the same thing with the interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure. It's pulling out of the blood. You put a minus. So if I give you numbers, you put minuses in front of those. And the bottom 2 are pluses. You just sum them together. Put the pluses over the minuses, simple math, and you do your equation. So do this one real quick. We're just going to look at the left side of the screen. This is the arterial side. This is where the high blood pressure is at. Blood's coming from the heart going into the tissues. Here you can see this is your blood pressure, your capillary blood pressure. That's pushing out of the blood. That was a what? Plus or minus? It's a minus 37 millimeters of mercury. Gush, gush. So when it gets down to the arterial, it's not 80 millimeters of mercury. At the arterial, it's actually only 37. So it's softened up. Here you have, these are colloids. When you see the little pi sign, it means that proteins are colloids. So you have 25 millimeters of mercury pulling back in. Is that a plus or a minus? It's a plus. So now you have a negative 37 and a positive 25. The last 2, you have the hydrostatic pressure. That's your skin trying to push stuff into the blood. What is that, plus or minus? Plus, so you have a minus 37, a plus 25, and a plus 1. And then you should not have free-floating proteins in your interstitial fluid. If you do, you have a problem. Like histamine, you have an allergic reaction. Normally this should be 0, but if it did have a number, where would it be going? Into or out of the blood? Out. So you'd have a minus here. You take those four numbers and you sum them. What's negative 37 plus 25? Negative 12 plus 1. Negative 12 plus 1 is negative 11. So if it's negative 11, what's it telling you? Reabsorb or filter? Negative was filtering. You're losing things on that side of the blood, which is good, because here you have fresh oxygen. Do you want the oxygen to leave the blood? Yep, you want it to leave the blood and go into the tissue. Do you want sodium and potassium and chloride and those electrolytes to go into that tissue? Yeah. Do you want glucose going into the tissue? Overall, you want to have filtration on the heart side of the blood vessel. But then when you get to the opposite side, now you have less blood pressure. Everything else has stayed the same. You didn't lose any proteins, right? So the proteins are the same on both sides. Your skin didn't squeeze any harder. You have no more proteins out here. So everything is the same except your blood pressure. Your blood pressure naturally should have gone down as it's going through the capillary. So now you do the exact same. Negative 17 plus 25 plus 1 minus 0. What do you get? You get 9. Is the 9 positive or negative 9? It's a positive 9, right? So this should actually be drawing the 9 positive back in. So you're pulling back things like CO2, lactic acid, waste products, excess water. You're pulling all those things that you don't want accumulating out here back into the blood to take it back up to the heart, to take it to the kidney, to take it and filter and clean it, to take it to the lungs, get rid of the CO2. So you subdivide this. Things should be filtering on the heart side, reabsorbing on the vein side, or I should say, filtering on the arterial or artery side and reabsorbing in the venular vein. Is it an even exchange? You have more going where? Do you have more going into the blood or going out of the blood by the end of this whole reaction? You have more going out. What should be happening to your tissue? It should be, if you're constantly adding to it, should be swelling all the time. Luckily, you have a backup route. You have an escape route for anything that accumulates. Right here, the lymphatics. Lymphatics take anything that didn't get pulled back into the blood, they pull it in and they circulate it back up to the heart and dump it back into the blood eventually. That's the next section we talk about. So if I gave you a problem, you should be able to take these figures, do the summing, and get what we call the net exchange or the net filtration reabsorption pressure. Your book walks through same thing. They just describe it a little bit different. So we don't have to worry about this all book stuff. This you do have to worry about. So you should be able to do this. Take 30 seconds or a minute and work through it. I'll give you some time because it's a little bit more complex problem. And I'm telling you now there will be one like this on the next exam. So you have to know these four. Actually, it's not just on the next exam. It'll be on the exam after that too because these same pressures are going to come back when we talk about the kidney and the lungs. Don't forget to get your flu shot. Public service announcement. Just saying. Okay, so what did you come up with? So the net filtration, if capillary blood pressure, plus or minus? Minus interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, plus or minus? Plus BCOP. Actually, let's do some math. Negative 28 plus 5 is negative 23, and then blood colloid osmotic pressure is pulling it back into the blood, so that's a what? Negative 23 plus 20. So we have negative 3, and then interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure is doing what? Subtracting it, so now you have a 5. What is that 5? Is it just 5? It's negative 5. I'm leaving all the negative and plus signs out so that nothing confuses you. You just have to look. If it's a negative, what do you know is happening? Reabsorption or filtration? It's filtration. So you know that number 5 has to be right. Or number 5. Number 1, which is -5, which is ultrafiltration, has to be right. Because your book says exactly, I'm telling you right now, the book says exactly the opposite. It says add and subtract, just the opposite. Ignore the book. All semester in general, nobody's going to come up to you in practice and say, is that filtration force positive or negative? They just expect you to know what's going on. When somebody's kidneys are shutting down and they're talking about the filtration forces or the glomerular filtration pressure, they expect you to know, is filtration, is it taking out of the blood or adding to the blood? It's taking out. It's filtering. It's cleaning the blood. It's trying to get crap out of the blood. If their glomerular filtration pressure went to 0, what's happening in their blood? Are they getting rid of the bad stuff? Nope. It's staying in their blood. So that's where these terms come back. They're not going to say, is that a negative or a positive? They don't give a damn. They want to know, is it working? Is the organ working or not? So you just need to be able to interpret that. And then lymphatics, where are we at? Yep, lymphatics are pretty simple. It's not that complex. So the terms, lymph is the fluid. So lymph is the actual fluid. And all lymph is filtered plasma. What's interesting about the body is anytime you see a fluid compartment in the body, guess what it is? It's filtered blood, which is just the plasma. You take the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the platelets out, and you have this straw-colored fluid, which is plasma. It's your body's own little dialysis kit, making synovial fluid, making vitreous humor. It's all just filtered plasma. When you have a snotty, runny nose, it's because you open up blood vessels and you filter the plasma, and you have that snot, that thick, fluidy plasma. Lymph is the same thing. The lymph vessels are the carrying structures. Lymph vessels, do you think they're going to be high pressure or low pressure? They're low. There's no blood pressure pushing into the lymphatics. The lymph is actually being moved by you flexing your muscles. Every time you squeeze a muscle, it squeezes the lymphatic vessels and pumps the lymph. It's not being pushed by blood pressure. It's not blood. There's no red blood cell. There shouldn't be any red blood cells in there. It's just things that were filtered through. When you look at the passageway, the lymphatics actually start. They're not a circulatory system. They have a beginning and they have an end. They start out here at the capillary beds, and you can see they kind of overlap the capillary bed. So if anything leaks into the capillary beds and doesn't get recollected, it goes into the lymphatics. It moves up past a valve. Why a valve? Why would that be there? To prevent the lymph from going backwards. So when you squeeze this capillary bed, it pushes the lymph up, and when you relax the capillary bed, it tries to come back, but it can't. It goes up to a lymph node. What's hanging out in the lymph node waiting? What do you have in your lymph nodes? Lots and lots of white blood cells. Yep. It's so that if you get bacteria in this tissue, and this is an awesome concept, if a bacteria gets in here, does it want to go to the lazy river, nice smooth flow of the lymphatics, or the high gushing rapids of your blood? Where does the bacteria naturally want to go? I'd go to the lazy river too. Bacteria goes over to the lazy river and just kind of eases its way along and unknowingly goes into the lymphatics where what's waiting for it? White blood cells to kill it, right? So bacteria doesn't want to go into your bloodstream. If it goes into your bloodstream, it's because it was directly pushed into the bloodstream typically. And that's a bad thing. All right, so it goes to the lymphatics, it gets cleaned up, processed, goes up, and gets dumped into the vena cava right outside the right atrium. So any of this fluid gets dumped back into the blood. So you don't lose any of the fluid, it just gets cleaned up a little bit by the lymphatics and then dumped back in. And then here you can see what we call the initial lymphatics. That's in the capillary bed, the beginnings. And the way they're designed is really, really cool. The way they're designed is that they're actually like shingles. They look a lot like a blood vessel, like a capillary blood vessel. But look at how they overlap. Instead of butting against each other with those pores or gaps, they actually overlap. So that when you push extra pressure in, they open like a valve, and then when it fills up on the inside, what's it do to that valve? Pushes the valve shut again. So that way it's a one-way. It's so cool the way the body's designed. There's so many things out there designed like that. When I was a kid, I liked to hunt crawdads or crayfish. I don't know what you call them here. But I lived by a creek, right? And I found this thing. It was like a little cage. So the crawdads could go in, but it was almost like a valve. They couldn't get back out. It's exactly the same design. It's amazing how you can apply these different things to everything in the universe, and it just works over and over again. The blood or the lymph gets in, but when it tries to push back out, it shuts the valve. And then it goes up past another valve until it finally goes out of the circulation and back into the blood. Right, so here are the main points of the lymphatics. First, to return anything that's excessively filtered. If your blood filters too much plasma out, it collects the excess and takes it back to the heart, dumps it back in. Next, defend against the disease. Like I said, if a pathogen gets in, or any kind of bacteria for that matter, hopefully it gets cleaned up in the lymphatics, the lymph nodes. Transport absorbed fat. This sucks bad. When you eat a Big Mac or a big cheeseburger or whatever, that grease that drips down your arm, grease is lipid loving. When it gets into your abdominal tract, is there any barrier preventing it from getting into your tissues? Nope. So it gets in. Most things like proteins and carbohydrates, they get transported straight to the liver because they're water soluble. They're directed to the liver in the GI tract. But fat can go right in. Fat can seep right through the capillaries in your GI tract, seep right past, go right into the lymphatics without being cleaned, go up the lymphatics and get dumped where? Into the right atrium of the heart. Exactly. So those unclean fats go right up to the heart. So with that feeling you get after you ate a big double, quadruple cheeseburger and then wash it down with that big fatty milkshake, that, it feels like your heart just wants to stop. Yeah, it's choking on the fat you just ate. Think about that next time. All right, so we'll talk about that more in the GI tract, and then return filtered proteins. If a protein seeps out, like histamine allows proteins to seep out, the reason that edema starts going down is because those proteins are being pulled back into the lymphatics and transported back up into the heart, dumped back into the blood. And then edema is what we'll start talking about when we come back next time, because it's 2:29 and I don't want to start edema. Okay.